And now, from the University of Chicago Institute of Politics and CNN, The Axe Files, with your host, David Axelrod.
If you're involved in politics or journalism in Washington, then you most likely know Mark Murray, the senior political editor for NBC News. Mark has been a presence around Washington for 2 decades, is a man who is incredibly knowledgeable about the granular details of American politics, the races, the polling, and the prospects for the future. He's also been a fellow at the Institute of Politics this spring. We got a chance to sit down the other day to talk about Donald Trump, the midterm elections, and the state of American politics. Mark Murray, senior political editor of NBC News, and more importantly to me, fellow at the University of Chicago Institute of Politics this spring. We got a lot of politics to talk about, and we'll get to that. But I want to get to how you got to where you are, a recognized national savant about electoral politics, and it began in McAllen, Texas.
That's where I grew up, David. And first, let me just say, it's been an amazing experience being at the University of Chicago with your students, to have like the regular interaction, the office hours, and the seminars. And this has been very good for me to get away from Washington for a little bit and interact with all the students. I can
only imagine.
It's hit the exact sweet spot for me.
It also makes you hopeful, to talk to to spend time with these kids, who are not. They're not cynical. They're skeptical, but they're not cynical, and they really care about the world.
And they are super informed, too. The questions have been amazing. But you are right. I grew up in McAllen, Texas, 8 miles away from the U.S.-Mexico border. And, in these debates about NAFTA, McAllen, Texas has been one of the NAFTA success stories, where the population when I grew up was about 50 or 60,000, and now it's more than 150,000, 160,000. In fact, the county, Hidalgo County, is one of the fastest growing counties in Texas and also the United States. And after growing up in McAllen, Texas, I went to the University of Texas.
Well, let's just stop at McAllen for a second. The thing that sticks in my mind is Atul Gawande wrote a book about healthcare, and he spent a lot of time in McAllen, and he talked about disparities. McAllen is now overwhelmingly Hispanic.
It's overwhelming. It's about 80% Latino. And to me, it was a fascinating place to grow up because of that. And you are exactly right. During the healthcare debates, and this was flagged by even President Obama in many speeches that he ended up giving, where all of a sudden a lot of the deliverable healthcare services were so much more expensive. And so some of the things that are actually put in the Affordable Care Act were meant to actually keep down the prices, that you shouldn't get 3 or 4 CAT scans or MRIs, that they were subscribing things to people. And that New Yorker article really kicked off an interesting conversation.
Because what he did was he compared McAllen to a nearby community,
El Paso, that had this similar demographic makeup.
Yeah, but different results. And he that made no sense. And it talked. The distortions in the system were there. So you had like a Friday Night Lights experience down there. High school football, man. Yeah, it's big in Texas.
It's a big in Texas now. It's not as in South Texas. It's not as competitive in places like Houston or San Antonio or even in Austin.
So how many people would show up at a football game?
Sometimes close to 15,000 people. Yeah. And this is in South Texas. And I still tell people to this day, the most nerve-wracking experiences I've had in my life were showing up at those games in front of all those people, as opposed to actually ever going on TV.
Because you were a running back?
I was, though I think I've been a much better journalist than a running back.
Well, it's safer to be a sports writer than to be a combatant.
I might argue the last year and a half might question what's safer nowadays.
Yeah. And you had a chance to go to out of state to an Ivy League school or something, but you went to you stayed at UT.
I was a third-generation Texas Longhorn. I looked around for some places to maybe go and play some football, but I'm fundamentally a burnt orange guy. My brother went to the University of Texas as well, too. And I went there, studied political science, history.
You always were interested in politics?
That was my foundation. And
why?
conversations with my dad, just talking about the 1960s, the 1970s, World War II, the Civil War, and
So he was a big buff.
big buff, big history buff, and I always just took it from him. And
Hidalgo County, I remember in tell me if I'm getting this wrong, but in Cairo's book about Lyndon Johnson, that played a big role in his landslide 200 vote victories.
There's been some interesting politics in South Texas. And yes, you're actually right. In LBJ and his run for the Senate, there was maybe some shenanigans by some folks. So I went to the University of Texas, but it wasn't until my junior year in school where I got interested in journalism. I went to go write for the Daily Texan, which at the time was either the 8th or 9th largest newspaper in the state of Texas.
It's a huge school.
It's a big school.
It's a huge
circulation.
paper,
yeah.
And what made you decide to do that?
Basically because I wanted something else on my resume. And by that time, I'd kind of gotten college under wraps, was making some pretty good grades, and wanted to expand my resume and start thinking about what I wanted to do beyond just enjoying my history and political science courses. And walked in, loved to write, and that turned into an internship out in San Francisco, and then an internship
At Mother Jones.
Mother Jones, an internship at Harper's Magazine in New York City, and then my first gig as a 22, 23-year-old writer at National Journal Magazine, and got hired 3 weeks before the Monica Lewinsky story took off.
What did the early reporting experience at UT and Mother Jones is that must have been a bit of a culture shift for you.
It was interesting being a Texan and never spending a whole lot of time other than family vacations outside of the state of Texas.
Probably not a lot of Longhorns at the
there
Mother
were
Jones
some
office,
Longhorns at Mother Jones, but it was mainly me just kind of getting adjusted to a big city. And from a journalism standpoint, when I started out the school newspaper, I wasn't a straight news reporter. I was actually a columnist. But what I ended up doing at Mother Jones, I was the fact checker for a lot of their magazine pieces, particularly the political ones. So I had to pick up the phone, fact the checks, check the facts, do all of that stuff. And that really started me on my reporting career.
Yeah, fact checking, that's a quaint thing.
It's important for all of us to do. I still go back
More important now maybe than ever.
I go back to every story I write and I underline every fact that I have an assertion in the story and make sure that I double or triple check it before I hit send.
So did you always know that you wanted to end up in Washington?
By the time that I think the internships, and particularly my last internship at Harper's Magazine, I desperately wanted to go to Washington, and it was all about how I could end up getting a reporting gig. And at the time, the New Republic was the magazine by a lot of people that I ended up reading, and that was out there. The Washington Monthly. Mm-hmm. I tried to get a job there, and it didn't work out. But National Journal was hiring some new young reporters, people right out of school, and it turned out that the editor at Harper's Magazine, Louis Lapham, called up the editor at National Journal and said, "You got to hire this Mark Murray guy." The rest is history. I crashed on a friend's couch for about a month, got an apartment in D.C., and I've been in Washington now for more than 20 years.
And you mentioned that you came in the midst of the Monica Lewinsky story. Did that immediately impact on you?
Absolutely. And, I kind of look back upon that experience and I see a lot of similarities between now and then. And certainly being at the federal courthouse and all the media scrums and what was actually going on in grand jury testimony. David, we haven't really experienced a lot of those kind of courthouse drama stories in the last 20 years. And to see it play out again, as it was in 1998, it really did. It was very impressionable. There were some people who were doing some really good journalism back in 1988. I was working with Michael Kelly, who was at National Journal, Stuart Taylor, a legal writer, and working for him. And so everybody was after the one big prize, and that was the impeachment and Monica Lewinsky story.
What are you, looking back, you could date it back to Newt Gingrich and his move to take over the House. It was a polarizing event, not just taking over from Democrats, but taking it over from moderate Republicans. And that led into the impeachment. And obviously in 2000, you saw this very close election with your governor, George W. Bush, winning on the basis of a 5-4 vote of the Supreme Court. And we've gone from there. How big was not just I know you learned about covering scandal from that moment, but what have all these things done to our politics?
Oh, it's made things worse, and everything plays for keeps. David, I think even looking back on that era in the 1990s, where obviously you had an impeachment and big battles, Travelgate, and testimony from Paula Jones, I look back on it, even in that era, particularly when George W. Bush took over, the Democrats and Republicans might disagree on items 1, 2, 3, or 4, but they could actually work together on 5, which might be education reform that George W. Bush was able to get done with Ted Kennedy. You look at transportation, and one of my first gigs at National Journal Magazine was covering transportation policy. And you had Bud Schuster, who was the powerful chairman from Pennsylvania, who was at the House T&I committee. You had people like Ray LaHood, who you know very well, who was on that committee. And those people worked together in a bipartisan way. And so I do think that you are right that we saw some of the precedents playing out during that Gingrich era and maybe even right before Gingrich took over as Speaker. But what has actually transpired today, I think, is fundamentally different than it was 20 years ago, where people don't agree on anything. Transportation policy, for example, has become just stonewalled, and no one wants to be able to do anything, whether you might want to raise the gas tax or come together in a bipartisan agreement. So I think that...
Yeah, this is at a time when there's all this evidence that our infrastructure is crumbling.
Right.
And so it's a safety issue, but it's a competitiveness issue. I mean, there's so many compelling reasons that both Republicans and Democrats should want to do this.
And another factor in all this is, even when Newt Gingrich was Speaker, he wasn't the all-powerful Speaker that we now actually see, what you saw from Nancy Pelosi or John Boehner or Paul Ryan, where they get to really call who the committee chairs are. Going back to Bud Schuster again, he sometimes was able to run circles around Newt Gingrich and get what he wanted when Gingrich disagreed. And so that era of, we can debate pork barrel projects and earmarks, if there was kind of a system on these very powerful committee chairmen that sometimes was able to produce results and the results that we can't get in today's politics.
Yeah, it's interesting. What do you think about that? I was one of the proponents for getting rid of earmarks. It seemed like because there were these, the Bridge to Nowhere and all of these projects that seemed to be a big waste of money, but they weren't necessarily emblematic of the majority of projects, and they also were a lever that leaders could use to try and forge consensus. Right. I mean, they were sort of the oil that greased the. And I wonder now whether that was a good thing.
Yeah, well, and certainly to be able to get members to take tough votes, it became some kind of currency to be able to say, look, I know you want this bridge. You're able to get it if you can give me this vote. And people could sometimes say that that's potential corruption. It certainly has been very good politics for everyone to say that they're against earmarks. But to me, as a former transportation reporter, the argument that always sticks is people say, well, who should be making these decisions? Should it be Congress and members of Congress in their own districts, or should it be the federal government that gets to dole out these things later on from the Department of Transportation or elsewhere? And what Congress has done is ceded those kind of projects to the federal government.
Yeah, I mean, the answer you get is that sometimes as well, it should be done properly through the budget process and so on, but it really doesn't work that way. I just, I wonder about many of the I consider I'm a congenital reformer. That's how I've always been, and reforming the party system, reforming some of these boondoggles, and reforming campaign finance, which desperately, needs it in some ways. But there's always a sort of unintended effect that you don't see coming.
Right.
And one of the effects of this is, I think, it's further complicated the ability of party leaders within Congress and presidents to forge consensus.
I agree. I still think the biggest force that kind of creates that is a roadblock for consensus is just the nationalization of our politics, and having Fox News and MSNBC and having those kind of where it's very hard for somebody who wants to cut a middle space to be able to do so. But I do agree that if I were ranking them, it might be that kind of nationalization or politics one, and then maybe earmarks 2 or 3.
Well, and then, look, I mean, I don't even know how to rate them. I think it's an amalgam of things. It's redistricting that's been beaten to death. But clearly, if you have districts in which you only have to worry about a primary, then your biggest concern about winning re-election is pleasing the most strident voices.
Absolutely.
In your own party. Our media habits, for sure, and not just on television, but in terms of social media. Huge challenge, because we set up these virtual reality universes in which our opinions are always affirmed. That's a big piece of it. But so as you wish that we would have a national discussion about this, but we'll get back to this, because some of this impacts on where we are and where we're going. You spent 5 years at the National Journal.
I did.
And was it your intention to remain a print reporter?
It was, and it's all. I mean, my favorite thing about journalism is being the writing and the crafting of, and it being at National Journal. And this was 20 years ago when the media looked very different, but I was allowed by my editors to spend 3 weeks working on a 5,000-word story. And so I could spend a day or two crafting the perfect lead. And that kind of craftsmanship I've always liked in journalism more than sometimes even picking up the phone on how do you tell the story, who do you interview, do you have all the facts straight. I go into Capitol Hill offices and interview with all the committee staff to get all the expertise from them before even writing my story. And that, to me is one of the biggest changes in journalism over the last 20 years, where the 3 or 4 weeks I used to have on a story to write 5,000 word, I now have about 20 minutes to bust out a 400 or 500 word piece.
I was just talking about this. Just today, I met with a group of students from The Gate, which is the political journal here at the Institute of Politics, and most of them are aspiring journalists. We don't have a journalism school at the University of Chicago. So everything is sort of ad hoc, and we're trying to encourage that as much as possible and see what we can do to help them along. And I told them that, when I was a reporter, we had these quaint things called news cycles, and news organizations were healthy and hardy enough to allow you the time to do the reporting, the writing, and the pressures under which reporters have to operate today, the competitive pressures. You've actually lived through that transition. I guess I have a hard time thinking of it as a healthy transition.
No. And in fact, to me, I think the biggest loss in how fast our news cycles have been, and one of the great things is that news is immediate. You get it instantly. It's a lot more diverse. There are new voices, or you're not just getting the word of God from
Walter
Cronkite, or even later, Tom Brokaw. That all of a sudden you can get news from so many different other people. But to me, the biggest loss has just been perspective and context, and also just memory. Where I think that a lot of times we forget what happened last week, and I've actually found a lot of my journalism that I've done, and I do with Chuck Todd in our First Read morning column, is sometimes looking back at just like, let's putting together what the last week was, just for perspective, or what the last month or the last year has actually been, because I think those are the things that get lost in how fast everything happens, as opposed to the days that it was only about 10 years ago, where big event happens, everyone covers it. Next day, you might have another analysis. Second day, another analysis piece, and people are still trying to get new developments. Now, all of those news cycles have been truncated into about a span of 3 or 4 hours.
And the question is, how much reflection can you really do in 4 hours? How much perspective can you provide in 4 hours? It's but the failure to do it puts you behind in the competitive cycle. It's hard. So what made you mentioned you're at NBC. I said that at the top, and you have been for 15 years. What made you decide to make that transition?
So NBC, along with Tim Russert at the time, were kind of looking to bulk up its political unit heading into the 2004 election. And they were looking for someone with more of a print background and a reporting background, and ended up getting the job. And to me at the time, it was like, well, should I go into this TV world? And what I've kind of found is that if you're kind of a good writer and a good thinker, you can thrive going from print journalism to TV.
What made you, though, decide, what tipped you in that direction?
I think what tipped me, and what I knew already, what was kind of told me was, like, since we were going to have a political note that was going to come out early in the morning, I knew it was going to be longer hours and a more demanding job. But I think what really was just the challenge of changing my beats. And again, I was covering transportation and education policy, writing about immigration, the fate of labor, some politics. But really what tipped me to go work for NBC was covering the biggest story out there, and those were the presidential contests and the political races. And
they held that out.
And I also, when I was at National Journal, I worked very closely with Charlie Cook and his team and got to see their whole operation. And Charlie's always been a mentor of mine. And so to be able to kind of
people,
what they do and be able to take a lot of that stuff over to NBC News.
Tell me about Tim. He was a friend of mine, and I revered him. And I think one of the things that he brought was the passion and perspective of a practitioner, because he had been in politics before he got into journalism. And so he treated it with a kind of skepticism, but also reverence that was contagious.
Mm-hmm. He was a fantastic journalist, a great questioner, a tremendous leader too. I mean, he, at the head of our Washington bureau, was just a boss everyone looked up to. Where I continue to have great leaders and bosses, but the aura around Tim was different than anyone else's.
Yeah, why?
Because he really was that great Sunday news journalist in the age where, before everyone started getting their media from maybe more partisan media, or how everything started getting split up. I mean, Tim was the person you tuned into on Sunday, and so everybody knew Tim Russert. But he was also so relatable, and he always talked about growing up in Buffalo.
Big Russ, his dad, the Buffalo Bills, yeah,
and just his command of sports. I remember my interview that I had with NBC at the time. First thing he talked to me about, and this was in 2003, and he said, "So tell me about that Texas Longhorn point guard T.J. Ford, who at the time was the player of the year in college basketball." And we chatted sports 10 minutes before we started getting into the nitty-gritty of the job interview, which made things much easier. And that's classic Tim Russert.
Well, he was thoroughly authentic. I remember, I did his show a few times, and I remember walking in for one of his shows, and I must have been representing, I think, the Obama campaign, and I think Jeff Guerin was there, the pollster representing the Clinton campaign, and I saw Tim walking to the studio before we were ushered in with a huge stack of papers under his arm, and he looked at me and said, "Are you ready?" and you really felt it, man. You felt like he was going to put you to the test, and not in a kind of contentious, gratuitous way, but in a very substantive way.
It was the challenge. And in a way, it was like a master chess player and someone preparing and taking the joy, not like, I'm going to embarrass you and defeat you, but I'm here for the pure joy of the game. And that's really what Tim, absolutely. It was that sense of joy. He
conveyed that.
And for Democrats and Republicans and everyone, and you had to be on top of your game. And, David, I also say, I remember my first few months on the job. In 2003 at NBC News, I went in for the first taping of Meet the Press, that since I had been an employee, and it was that interview he did with Howard Dean, who at that time was starting to really take off in the polls in that race. And Tim and Dean had an hour-long debate and question and answer session. You don't have those at all anymore now. And it wasn't really even until minute 40 that it started to get contentious between the two. And I'm incredibly close to Chuck Todd at NBC News, and talking about how the formats have changed and our media has changed, but now you can't have those hour-long discussions with a single politician. Even if you end up getting the headliner like the President of the United States or a presidential nominee, you might have 20 minutes. But back then, 15 years ago, you had 60 whole minutes with Howard Dean.
The last time I saw Tim was in Indianapolis in 2008. Obama was on his way to the nomination, and it was an hour-long show. And it was a rigorous show. I also remember, by the way, his Senator Obama's interview with Tim in October of 2006. He had told Tim on Meet the Press the previous year that he wasn't going to run for office in 2008. We were driving down from Philly to Washington to prep him for the show. Robert Gibbs and I were with him, we said, he's going to ask you, he's going to play the tape of you saying you weren't going to run, and he's going to ask you if that's still your position. What are you going to say? And we didn't know what he was going to say, and he said, I'm going to say no. I'm going to say I've changed my mind, and I'm going to tell him why. And we're like, but we both shot a look at each other like, this is going to be big. And Robert turned to Obama and said, "Sir, have you mentioned this to Mrs. Obama?" And Obama said, "Ooh, yeah, that's really, I should
tell your wife before Tim Russ.
But you know what? He did it. The question came up predictably. He answered honestly. And Tim called me the next day and he said, "No one's ever done that before." He says, "I've been doing this for 17 years and no one's ever just said, you know what? I changed my mind."
Well, we continue to play that clip because it's always a reminder when people say, well, I'm not really interested in running for the presidency. Yes. We know that you can end up changing your mind. And I remember that because Tim ended up expressing kind of a glee. Oftentimes there are two reactions you can have. You have the, aha, yes, I've got you. Or the other hand, I have really big news that NBC News just has right now. Yeah. And so that's how that was.
Well, I think there was actually a lesson in that for all candidates for president, which is authenticity really matters. Mm-hmm. And when you go up there and you're plainly thinking about running for president and you pretend you're not, people sense that. The camera does read that. Mm-hmm. And Tim was great at sort of torturing people who were playing that game. So that was actually a really interesting exchange. So you did get to cover presidential politics in 2004. What did you learn in that campaign?
I learned that our politics is divided, and that even
how much were you traveling, and how much were you in the office?
So my job at NBC News has always been the person who helps manage the people that we have on the bus, and so I'm usually there. Resource to, hey, what's going on with the other campaign? What's the polling data out there? What are the questions I need to ask at these kind of gaggles? But my experience being out there, I was there, throughout all the build up to the Iowa caucuses. Every debate that NBC News would end up happening, I was there helping to put together some of the questions that we'd have for the primaries that were going on. And then, of course, all the conventions, all the general election debates that we'd be kind of live from. And after a while, even though I wasn't on the bus, I was going from debate, site to site. It was a whirlwind. And to me, it was, given that was the first presidential race I got to cover, I thought it was amazing. But you had
covered, Joe. You had spent some time, I guess, a few months at the Texas Observer when you were a young buck, and those were during the George W. Bush years. So he was very familiar to you
when he was governor. Yes, and so obviously, we Texans kind of know each other pretty well.
Signify in ways that others of us wouldn't understand.
Correct. But because of 2004, so much of my coverage was more on that Democratic side. And this is what Democrats are going to have to play with in 2020, where the preponderance of the race is not the general election, but it's the primary battle that goes on. Yeah. And so we spent so much time. And really, to me, and one of the things that I've actually been doing through my seminars here at the University of Chicago, and one of my first introductions was on frontrunner bias. And I talked to him about Howard Dean, because when he actually started to take off in the polls, the race, not only from the candidates like Dick Gephardt and John Edwards who were trying to stop him, but it also became, he was the most...
Not to mention John Kerry.
But he was the most... But Dean was the most scrutinized candidate from everyone, particularly the media. In my news organization, along with some of the help that I was able to do, we were the ones who stumbled upon Howard Dean making comments that criticized the caucus.
In Canada, right?
In Canada for Canadian public television.
Yeah.
And we had those tapes. It came out about 2 weeks before the Iowa caucuses.
Memo to candidates: tapes that are made in Canada also can play in the U.S.
They can, and the Dean campaign didn't know about those things, so they had to do some homework after the fact. But
well, there's an interesting parable about that, though. I mean, it is an interesting parable because presidential races are like pole vaulting. You clear a lower height, and then it becomes more difficult and more difficult. Howard Dean was shot from a cannon. He went from a guy who really wasn't considered a frontline candidate for president because of social media, because of the movement that he helped create around the war. He instantly became he went from backbencher to frontrunner, and with that comes enormous scrutiny. And if you're not ready for that test, you're going to break apart.
That's right. And that to me has always been, when we talk about front-runner bias and the front-runner scrutiny, if you want to be president of the United States and you can't keep it together and have to answer all the tough questions in the build-up to Iowa, you're probably not going to do a really good job in the White House. And so I think there's a big rationale for why the front-runner should get the preponderance of all the tough questions. But as I've told your students, we'd had videos, Canadian interviews of, say, John Edwards or even Dennis Kucinich in that same race, they wouldn't have gotten near the attention that the ones of Howard Dean at that exact time did, because he was ahead in the polls.
Yeah. Well, I agree with you about the process. I'm a defender of the process, as crude and stupid and trivial as it can be, because it does expose these candidates to pressure, and the better they do, the more pressure they're exposed to. And you do get a sense. I learned about Barack Obama watching him as a candidate, and we had been friends for years before he ran for president, and he had been a client for several years before he ran for president. But I confess, I didn't know how he was going to deal with. I knew the pressures would come because I'd been through these before, but he hadn't. And the truth is, he ran a Senate race here in Illinois. We did this together. And, Alan Keyes was 50 points behind him and got under his skin. And so I didn't know how he was going to handle all of that. It was kind of a revelation to see him handle pressure the way he did in the presidential race. And he grew in that process as well. But I do think, he as you remember, he won the Iowa caucuses in 2008 and then unexpectedly lost the New Hampshire primary. And I think in a sense, voters were saying, you know what? You're 4 years out of the Illinois State Senate. We're going to make you run the whole gauntlet here. We want to see how you deal with the whole deal before we give you the keys to the car. And I think it was, it was wise.
But it was also, when I look back upon that 2008 New Hampshire race in my mind, and looking back at the 2016 election, and I've been talking to your students about this, and even the Democratic primary in Michigan, there's a reminder that we do have sometimes black swan elections that defy the polling, defy what, we had come out of that 2004 election where, boy, if you end up winning Iowa and you have the momentum like John Kerry did, well, you're going to end up winning New Hampshire. And sometimes those rules get broken.
Well, and in fact, we made the same assumption, and we entered New Hampshire like a conquering army, and we campaigned with hubris, big crowds, celebratory crowds, and Hillary Clinton, having been humbled in Iowa for the first time in the whole campaign, got very close to the ground. Her vulnerabilities were clear, and she seemed much more accessible, much more relatable. And so, most of the time in 2008, and the reason that Obama became president is that we resisted conventional thinking. But one of the bits of conventional thinking that we accepted was that if you win Iowa, New Hampshire's 5 days later, you'll probably win New Hampshire too. And we assumed too much.
Well, and also the nature of it being an open presidential contest where, George W. Bush was term limited. So New Hampshire voters could end up saying, you know what, we do want to kick the tires. We want this to play out longer. Where in 2004, Democrats were facing a popular George W. Bush at the time after the Iraq War, when that was popular, and they might say, hey, we need to end this primary season as soon as possible. And so there was probably more motivation.
Beyond that, and I think these are sort of back-of-brain judgments in certain ways. I don't know that people sit down there and think as strategically as that, but they do make these sort of rough judgments that are right. In 2004, of course, John Kerry was the senator from Massachusetts, which gave him a huge advantage in New Hampshire. It was thought that he couldn't win Iowa. When he won Iowa, I think the New Hampshire thing was there for him.
And there was also that scream heard around the world, which is really the most first viral moment in American
scream,
the Dean scream. And David, so I was at that.
For those who don't remember, Howard Dean lost the Iowa caucuses after leading for much of the late fall. And when the vote was tallied and he came out and spoke, he was, fair to say, overwrought in a way that was a little bit shocking.
But I have a different perspective. So I was in that ballroom covering the Dean concession time, finishing third. It was so loud and crazy at the time. And what happened was that the pool mic ended up drowning out all the noise, blocked all the noise from the ballroom. Tom Harkin was 3 times or 10 times louder than Howard Dean was. And so it made it seem, if you were in the ballroom like I was, Dean didn't seem as odd as it came across on TV, which is a reminder for all candidates, always play more to the TV cameras than play to the ballroom at the time. But I always I remember coming back to the NBC workspace, there was Charlie Cook, and he said, Mark, what do you think of Howard Dean? I said, I thought he gave a pretty good concession. He might be able to go into New Hampshire to save it. And he said, he was unhinged on TV. Yeah. And of course, being present in that ballroom versus seeing on TV, you had 2 different realities.
Yeah, that's a really interesting lesson for candidates and also for advanced people.
Yes.
Because he should have been forewarned.
And I can make the argument that had that scream not have happened, Dean would have had at least a 50-50 shot of holding on to New Hampshire, where he was ahead in the polls.
And he was also from a neighboring state.
Yeah, Vermont.
Yeah. So you went on from 2004. Talk about your own journey during those intervening years.
Well, not only was it the great 2008 presidential contest, but my wife, who at the time was Candy Crowley's producer at CNN.
I remember her well.
And Sasha and I got engaged and got married in the span of the beginning of the 2007.
You guys met on the trail?
We met actually in the Dean ballroom. So 2 hours before the scream heard around the world, she came up to me and she said, hey, I think we had met, in a DC bar a few years earlier. We'd kind of talked about that, but it was right before that scream.
Now, have you told Governor Dean that he was the...
my brother-in-law, who
something good came out of that disastrous night?
Chuck Todd, when he was at Hotline, wrote up that story, and later my brother-in-law ran into Howard Dean and said, my sister and brother-in-law ended up getting married like right before your scream. And so he wrote down something. I was glad I could have provided some entertainment beforehand. But but we covered the 2008 race as competitors, me being at NBC and Sasha being at CNN. But the one nice thing was that NBC and CNN often had a baby pool type of arrangement. So if we needed to actually share a camera for cost sharing reasons, NBC and CNN had a kind of a natural agreement. Oftentimes Candy and Andrea Mitchell would kind of work together on a single camera. So I often used to say, CNN was always my second favorite network, particularly when Sasha was there.
Yeah. Let's talk about 2016. I know that you've been reflective about what might have been or should have been done in terms of covering that race. Talk about it from your perspective. What happened in terms of coverage? Because there was even and I was sitting on a CNN set, and I was a purveyor of conventional wisdom, so I'm not exempting myself from this. What happened in terms of the cover? I have my own thoughts,
right.
But
so we were talking about front runner bias, whether it happened to Howard Dean in 2004, Barack Obama, even Hillary Clinton before Barack Obama won the Iowa caucuses. The front runner gets the scrutiny. what I've really reflected on and through a lot of my reporting is that, what was different about 2016 than all the other presidential races I've covered, and maybe also since you've been in presidential politics, is that one person was assumed that they were going to win and the other person was assumed they were going to lose. And even in your 2008 race, Barack Obama versus John McCain, I think there was a lot of coverage from my vantage point of, John McCain was taken seriously. All of the tires were kicked. There was a sense of, will there be a Bradley type of effect? How with the polls, can you really believe them? Despite George Bush's popularity, despite the Iraq War, despite the poll numbers that we were seeing.
Bradley effect, reference to Tom Bradley, who ran for governor of California in the 80s and was ahead in the polls and then lost. The theory being because of racial bias in the polls and the electorate.
And there was a lot of good journalism that was done in the 2016 election. I look at David Fahrenthold at the Washington Post, who won the Pulitzer Prize last year for his reporting on the 2016 race, and the Trump Organization and the Trump Foundation, and so many must-watch debates, and clicks and views were at all-time high in the 2016 race. But collectively, I think there was this view of Hillary Clinton's going to win and Donald Trump's going to lose. And that actually ended up creating some disparities in coverage. And you look at some Harvard studies that show that the email story was the most covered story in the 2016 election. I personally think that it was a legitimate story for us to cover, but there are a lot of people who make some very good arguments that it shouldn't have been the number one story of 2016. You end up looking at how Donald Trump was able to dominate cable TV at his rallies, particularly very early on in the Republican primary season.
Completely dominated them.
And I don't.
I mean, both our networks are culpable in that, because he had the inspiration that if you light yourself on fire, people will come in and cover the fire. And if you're willing to,
but early on,
strap your asbestos on and do it again and again.
Early on, when he was doing that, though, it was seen as entertainment rather than here is someone who's going to potentially win the Republican nomination or end up being president. And so I think
it does speak, Mark, to the tension in news organizations between being a public trust and being a business. And the business side demands that if there's something that might draw eyeballs to your air, then you're going to go to it. And that's the thing that Trump counted on. And it competes with the other side, which is, are we overweighting coverage of one candidate because he's in Technicolor and the others are all in black and white?
Or the other important coverage is that, this is public accountability journalism, and it's the first test of before someone ends up getting in the White House. Can this person withstand the scrutiny? Does this person, do their businesses, do their behavior, did that actually need to have extra amount of scrutiny? Because that actually might, how you often campaign is how you govern, and that's always been how I think, a lot of the good scrutiny that you end up seeing the campaign trail. But again, I think in 2016 there was an assumption where there's no way this guy is going to win. And David, also one of the reasons that a lot of political reporters had that, it wasn't just conventional wisdom. When you're chatting with Republican sources, they were pretty much admitting the same thing. Now, even I argue in 2008 and 2012, we ended up, when we chat with both sides, we end up hearing everyone's best argument. But when you're on the phone and people are saying, look, our poll numbers, we're probably not going to be able to win this race. We only have a 15% chance of winning. You take that at face value.
There's no doubt that going into Election Day, that there was, in the Trump camp itself, a profound belief that he wasn't going to win. But I wonder how much, Mark, a part of it is that the media is generally aggregated in Washington, in New York, on the coasts. I was struck during the campaign, I think I must have said this here before, but that my neighbors in rural Michigan all had Trump signs in their yards, and my neighbors in downtown Chicago were almost to a person for Hillary Clinton. Neither could imagine the other candidate winning. And in fact, I think that Trump did get some of the scrutiny that you're talking about late, but to some of his voters, it felt like, and continues to this day to feel like, the elites piling on because Trump is challenging the status quo.
Well, one other thing that I think we got right in 2016 was that we knew what Trump represented in the movement he had created. I mean, all of my colleagues who would be at a Trump rally or event, I mean, we'd have the man...
Sometimes at their own risk.
At their own risk, but we interviewed all of Trump's supporters and asked them what they thought and really knew where they were coming from, and those voices, to me, were very powerful. There was the assumption, however, that while Trump ended up having that powerful core committed base, that demographics or the elections, how we'd always seen, would kind of continue to play out again, that Hillary Clinton would be able to take the Barack Obama coalition, and she had the better campaign, the better data, and that she was going to be able, even if the polls showed a 2-point race, well, she was going to win by more than that. And I think that was the assumption that continued to drive a lot of coverage. And when you talk about the Trump scrutiny...
It was wrong. Not wrong because of the result, but there were real questions to be raised about the campaign that they were running.
The campaign they were running, that also argued to me one of the biggest shortcomings in our coverage collectively of Donald Trump is, what would he end up doing with his business empire if he became president? We asked all the questions, and legitimate ones, to Hillary Clinton. What are you going to do with the Clinton Foundation? And by August and September, they had a plan to how you would actually wind it down and disassociate themselves from it. The similar tough questions really weren't ever asked about Trump's own business.
Yeah, but I'm not even sure how much of a difference it would make. I mean, we sit here and we record this conversation on tax day,
right,
2 days after tax returns were due. It strikes me that another year is going to pass by where the President of the United States, in contravention of common practice, will not release his tax returns because he doesn't think the public should know what his finances are or where he's making money or how or whether he's paying taxes. And he doesn't pay a penalty for that with his base.
Mm-hmm. Correct. But it's always important to remember that when I look at data, that Trump base is about 35% of the electorate. And those, again, are the people who are going to support him no matter what. But his formula to be able to win and pull off the inside straight that he did on 2016 and to be able to win re-election, he's going to need to build that by 10 points more. He's going to need to be at 46, 47. And so the kind of question becomes, how does he end up getting there? And that base just isn't enough. And when I currently look at his polling that's out there, he is speaking.
You guys just had a poll.
We did have a poll. We had his job approval rating at 39%. And when he is just talking to that 35%, there's an explanation on why it is what it is, because he is not looking at the middle of the electorate. I'm sure when you were in the White House or having campaigns, you might end up saying, all right, who is the kind of swing voter and independent that we want to be able to kind of win over with this policy? Well, President Trump isn't making those kind of calculations in his White House.
The reality, they would say, is there is no middle of the electorate, and it's really a battle about voter mobilization, and that when he's on the ballot, that he will, and when there's a choice, that he can mobilize his base more readily. But he has an election in between that we should talk about. In 2018, Democrats need 23 seats to take over the House of Representatives. The Senate is a 51-49 Senate right now, 51-49. And although there are barriers to Democrats that don't exist, particularly on the House side. Just give me your overview of where you think 2018 lies now and the tea leaves that you read in the elections that we've seen since 2016.
So Democrats have the advantage of winning the House of Representatives in 2018, but it's about the same kind of advantage that Hillary Clinton probably had going on Election Day 2016, which I think is a reminder for all of us covering it that it's not baked in, that, you know.
For those of you who are listening, that's called a disclaimer.
And, you know, smart Republican strategists I speak with put their odds at about 40% of keeping the House of Representatives. So, you know, to me, if 40% is about Kevin Durant's chances of making a three-pointer, which are usually pretty good. So I think you have to kind of keep that in mind.
I have to bring up a Texas guy.
He is. I make rooting for the Golden State Warriors this playoff season because of Kevin Durant. But Democrats have the advantage, but it's not a slam dunk. But when you talk about those races that we've seen already, and what to me has been really fascinating, you can end up putting about, on average, 10 or 12 points on the Democratic performance in these special elections that we've seen versus what the performance was in 2016 for Hillary Clinton, or even the past incumbent who had ended up running in that race. And so Democrats are really fired up. And this is even more pronounced in neutral environments, races that Republican and Democratic operators aren't even paying attention to from nationally. Like we ended up seeing that Wisconsin Supreme Court
race. Yeah,
there were 1 million votes that were cast. I mean, this was a statewide race.
This is the recent race where a Democrat won a Supreme Court seat by 12 points.
And you did not see the big flood of Republican money that we ended up seeing, like in that Georgia 6 race last year, or even the Pennsylvania 18 race earlier this year. And in that kind of environment where the national parties aren't paying that much attention, the national press corps, it hasn't become nationalized, in a neutral type of environment, Democrats are way overperforming. Now, there are going to be so many races that Republicans are going to be able to nationalize in House, Senate, and even gubernatorial races, but you're not going to be able to do them everywhere, including some state legislative races, other races way down the ballot. And to me, that is the potential formula for a very big wave for Democrats. And the question is, can they just end up maximizing it? I mean, to me, I almost look at Election Day 2018 and Democrats' worst case scenario with the new redistricting map in Pennsylvania, with the retirements. Worst case scenario, Democrats are going to pick up 15 to 18, 20 House seats and maybe just be short of a House majority. Best case scenario, they end up winning 40 or 50 House seats. They end up flipping the United States Senate. They take over state legislatures across the country. They get important governorships in Ohio and in Florida. And that is what the wave is. And this is what political strategists, with the ad money, with all the spending, all the coverage, and the candidates themselves have to determine, where does this go? Is it the Dem plus 15, or is it Dem plus 40 or plus 45? And that to me is the range.
One of the interesting things is that Republicans felt the tax bill would be their ticket to tamping down Democratic gains, but the tax bill itself has lost some popularity since it had spiked up a little after its passage. Beyond that, it's very hard to direct a campaign around any particular issue when the president is so undisciplined in his own messaging and continually creates sideshows that bring the focus back to him and his personality. And it seems to me one of the issues in the fall is going to be, are you going to provide checks and balances or not?
Well, that's always been, I mean, midterms usually are about the person in office. And that was true for even Barack Obama in 2010 and 2014. And a tried and true message is, yes, I'll be a check and balance on this president. And so you have that playing out. But Republicans, they always tell me that they needed to be able to pass the tax legislation, because the worst case scenario, no matter where the polling is, and the polling isn't great on this tax bill, but had they done nothing with unified control of Washington, that would have been a worst case scenario where voters would have said, well, what's the point of having Republicans in charge of the White House and Congress where we can't even pass something that was easily done in the George W. Bush years? And, passing taxes is in Republican DNA. Why couldn't they end up doing that? So they had to get something done. But I would argue you're exactly right that Trump, all the stories around him make it very difficult for Republicans.
Trump's all.
But at the same time, sometimes the trumping all makes it hard for Democratic candidates to get their message out. And that was certainly the case in 2016. Now, it might be a little bit different because not every House candidate's under the glare of the national spotlight. But Democrats, to being able to make up their own economic arguments when the story of the day is Russia this, Russia that, income return that, Stormy Daniels, whatever.
But you see in the special in Pennsylvania where Connor Lamb was elected in a seat that was clearly a seat that Republicans normally would have won, or in Alabama, which was extenuating circumstances. You saw two candidates run races that were very much tailored to their district, their state. That seems like a formula for victory. We should point out that another element of this is that 41 Republican members of Congress have announced that they're not going to be running for their seats. It's easier to beat non-incumbents than incumbents. What did you make of Speaker Ryan's decision not to run?
So there were two. The first was it was yet another sign of how Trump has really taken over the Republican Party, although, of course, that shouldn't be a surprise because the President of the United States is head of that party. But because Ryan was diametrically opposed to Trump on so many key issues, whether it was entitlements and trade, kind of a moralistic view of politics, and Paul Ryan and Donald Trump were exact opposites. And Paul Ryan leaving kind of said something about the state of the Republican Party. But to me, it was also a statement about the midterm elections.
He didn't expect to be coming back as the speaker.
Well, and even if Republicans ended up getting the best case scenario that I was saying, that
ungovernable chamber,
Democrats only pick up 15 or 18 seats. Paul Ryan's job is so much worse, even in that kind of situation where you only can afford to lose 4 or 5 Republicans. He was already having a hard time when it was just being able to lose 18 or 20. Well, what happens when your margin is only 3 or 4 Republicans? And so it was going to be a difficult job. And David, Paul Ryan was also someone who didn't really ever want to be speaker. He kind of did it out of necessity. No one else was going to step up to the plate. And I think he decided this was always a short term. This was never going to be a career-long aspiration for him. And you add up the tough midterm environment, I think the very difficult thing of always having to answer for any kind of controversy that Donald Trump had ended up stepping into, and knowing that this wasn't a dream job, and I think it made it easier to step away. I was surprised at the reaction that President Trump had, where he had a very congratulatory tweet, because if I were the White House, I would have been, because so many people interpret that waving the white flag, well, there's Paul Ryan, he's already headed out the door. This midterm election is incredibly crucial for President Trump because Democrats in charge of the House of Representatives. That means that Elijah Cummings is head of House
Oversight Committee.
Adam Schiff is head of the House Intel Committee. And I think a lot of the things that the Obama White House ended up seeing transpire in 2015 and 2016 would almost be the news.
In other words, investigations,
Benghazi, all of that stuff, and would end up playing out in a cycle where we're beginning the president's reelection.
We should just say we don't want to give the Senate short shrift. Democrats have a real task in the Senate just because they have 25, 26 seats up, Republicans just 9. And 10 of them are in states that Donald Trump carried, some by significant margins like Missouri and North Dakota and West Virginia and Indiana. So it's a real uphill battle for Democrats to take the Senate.
It is. And so the formula is for them that they need to be able to pick up at least 2 and then hold all of their tough races. And that's from Heidi Heitkamp in North Dakota to Joe Manchin in West Virginia to be able to withstand. And this environment, at least for Democrats, is the best kind of situation they could have hoped for. If you were a Claire McCaskill or a Joe Manchin and Hillary Clinton had ended up winning in 2016, this was going to be a really tough environment for you. So I kind of look at that Missouri Senate race as a pure 50-50 contest, and we'll see who ends up winning.
Finally, what is the environment like for reporters now in this Trump era? Chuck Todd, who's been around for a long time and does I think he's pretty tough on everybody. Came under fire from the president in one of his tweets. I don't know whether you consider that an honor or a burden. Call him Sleepy Chuck and so on. How difficult is it? Some of your reporters at NBC have come under personal fire, certainly some at CNN. What's the environment in the newsroom now? It's
tough. You always, as a reporter, have to have a lot of dragon skin. I mean, we get criticized even before the Trump era from anyone, and you have to be tough and you end up believing in your own reporting. And of course, you mentioned Chuck. He's a dear friend. He's a fantastic Sunday show host. He's tough on both sides. He's just a pleasure to work with. But to me, in this Trump era, and where you can kind of call people names and always kind of declare things fake news, it really does damage our democracy. And while the news media and the Fourth Estate was never written into the United States Constitution, a strong and vibrant press. And I would think of tough press at the power that be, and going and holding power accountable is incredibly important. And you look at places that actually aren't doing that anymore, whether it's Russia or Hungary, and you don't have a vibrant democracy anymore. And to me, what has really changed in the last year and a half, or since then candidate Trump was on the campaign trail, is people saying, oh, well, that's fake news, or why should we end up believing you? And when you equate news organizations that do fantastic work, and sometimes we do mess up, to fake news, that is the Donald Trump was endorsed by the Pope and things that were made out of whole cloth from factory mills in Romania.
There is fake news.
There is fake news. Journalists from NBC to CBS, the New York Times, the Washington Post, there's some stories that we do. We're infallible. We can sometimes screw up, but we're not fake. And to me, to be able to have the President of the United States disagree with an article or try to spin it and just call it fake news, it does a lot of damage. And I've been telling your students, as well as future aspiring journalists, that people like me, and one of the reasons I'm doing the seminars I'm doing, is to be able to get as much trust back, because we have so much work to do, and it's going to take a lot of us. But for me to be able to put the state of journalism in a good place where the future Mark Murrays and Sasha Johnsons, who are 22, 23 years old, want to get in the business, we have a lot of work to do to be able to put them in a position to succeed.
Well, Mark, thank you for doing that. Thank you for the time you're spending here at the Institute of Politics, and thank you for fighting the good fight in terms of the role that the Fourth Estate has to play, shining a bright light in dark corners.
Thanks, David.
Thank you for listening to the Axe Files, part of the CNN Podcast Network. For more episodes of the Axe Files, visit cnn.com/podcast and subscribe on iTunes, Stitcher, or your favorite app. And for more programming from the University of Chicago Institute of Politics, visit politics.uchicago.edu.